Thank you very much for coming. My name is Austin Williams. I run the Future Cities Project and the Bookshop Barnies. Today we're looking at this book, No One Left. It's not a comment about the Labour government, but the subtitle gives it away, Why the World Needs More Children. And given the fact that you kind of can't move books and articles on Malthusianism, saying that there's too many people, it's actually quite refreshing to read the idea that maybe there's not enough, or maybe it won't be enough soon. And Elon Musk said, I think it was the day before yesterday, that the population collapse is coming. To do this kind of justice, we need more lands, we need more land, more resources, more development. All the jokes are here. Anyway, look, the main thing to say is that it's a really fascinating book, very timely, very relevant, and very thought-provoking, let's just say that. I urge you to get a copy. Paul is going to be signing after this session at the bookstall. The book starts with this kind of great line. There's quite a few great lines in here, but it says, we are seeing the birth pangs of a new epoch, but it's an epoch without birth pangs. So that gives you the kind of the poetic flourish that you'll find in the book. A little bit about Paul. He's a leading demographer, study of human populations, but don't let that put you off. The door is now closed. It's a readable book. It raises a whole series of issues, hot ticket issues like Israel. I mean, it's slightly different to what you might imagine about Israel today, but about Israel, about feminism, immigration, environmentalism, China, and China's just announced it's lost 850,000 people from its population, I think, in the last couple of years. So, very, very astute observations and political commentary on it. I think there's only 4 departments of demography in this country, which obviously, if demography departments can't reproduce, then we really have a problem. But Paul is married with 3 children, not a bad scorecard, unless it's being marked by Boris Johnson, of course. He's associate member of Birkbeck, University of London, and a senior member of St Anthony's College, Oxford. And the way that Barney works is that I'm giving Paul 5 minutes, just 5 minutes, to kind of lay out the general ideas in the book. He can't get it across in all that time, so I'll then ask several questions, 4 or 5 questions, just to tease out a little bit more so you get a broader picture before you get to the bookstore and buy a copy yourselves. So there you go. It'll be out to you for comments and questions, not just questions. If you have any observations or disagreements, please feel free. So there you go. Over to you, Paul, if you want to give your spiel.
Well, thank you very much. I was here a couple of years ago, and at that point I'd just written an article in the Sunday Times which they chose to headline, Is It Time to Tax the Childless? And I said when I was here that I couldn't guarantee that article alone, for all the furore it caused, had created a national baby boom, but within 2 menstrual cycles of my article being written, both my daughters were pregnant. And I'm pleased to say the 2 subsequent grandsons are the people to whom the book is dedicated. And I've got another one on the way. So what is the book about, and how can I sum it up in 5 minutes or 4.5 minutes after telling a relevant anecdote? First of all, what's happening? What's happening is that we're having too few children as a human race. Started off very much as a wealthy European thing. We went through the demographic transition and then went below. Japan's the only other really developed, fast developed country with low fertility back in the early 70s. Sub-replacement for 50 years. It is no longer a white European thing. If you think about countries that are poor, you assume they will have larger families, and generally they do. What's happening is that even poor countries are moving to this very fast. Some data suggests that Jamaica has a significantly lower fertility rate than Britain. Many parts of India do. Thailand has a much older, smaller fertility rate and rapidly ageing population compared to the UK. So this is a global phenomenon. There are parts of the world which still have very large families, and I'm all in favour of helping people control their fertility. But once they can control it, the point is, where does it go? And the answer is very, very low, and I find that alarming. Why is it alarming? What's the problem? So the fact is thing 1, the problem is thing 2. Personally, I think having children is a wonderful thing. I would recommend it to anybody, but of course being poetic and extolling the virtues of the kind of life that I've led doesn't cut much ice. I'm not a moralist, I'm a demographer. So what I'm really trying to say is that as populations decline, not only do we lose something wonderful, which is human life, but we age very rapidly and we have a problem with economics. And let me capture this for you in one statistic. If you look at Japan, which is an extreme example, but not that different from the rest of us, when Japan was on the way up and got to 100 million people in the 1960s, it had 8 workers for every retiree. Population went up, too few children, population came down. When it gets back to 100 million, sometime in the 2040s, instead of having 8 people working to support one retiree, it will be barely 1 for 1. So it's not so much the absolute number that matters, it's the age structure. When you've got long life expectancy, a wonderful thing, people living long lives, expecting pensions, expecting healthcare, fewer and fewer people paying the taxes, you are going to have sclerotic societies, you're going to have a lack of innovation, and you're going to have a real crisis of government support, the welfare state, debt to GDP ratios. Look at Italy, look at Japan. If you look at the sclerotic nature of so many of our economies, the fundamental issue, I think, is demography. So what gets thrown back at me? 4 quick points. Feminism. What about women? Well, actually, women say they want 2 to 3 children. Work done by Miriam Cates has supported this. How do we help them get there? How do we actually not go back to the 50s, but forward to the 2030s in a world where men play a full role, but women can actually have the number of children they wish to have? It's time that all feminists, many do already, listen to what women actually say they want. Immigration surely can solve the problem. Well, if it's a global phenomenon, moving people around the globe won't help. We've had mass immigration in Britain from Ireland, for example, more recently Poland. These are now low fertility countries which don't have a huge wage gap with the UK. In fact, Ireland has high. So there's no, this sort of imperial assumption we will forever be an attractive venue is going away. So the world can't rely on immigration to solve a lack of children. The environment, well, if you're consuming people's labour and you don't have that labour yourself, you suck it in from low emissions countries to high emissions countries, so it doesn't really help the problem. I'm very sceptical about AI actually solving this problem. If we're on the verge of an AI revolution that's going to substitute labour, it will have lots of big impacts. But if it's going to substitute labour, we would now be seeing fantastic growth in economic productivity. But we're seeing very stagnant productivity. So the work that we do is not creating much more value than it did in the past, which suggests that for all the amazing innovations which were supposed to replace labour, from the robots and the internet to AI, may disappoint us. And we are going to be short of those hands to do so many things, from bin men to brain surgery. So those are the kind of ripostes that I get, and those are my ripostes to the riposte. What can we do about it? I think 2 big things. First of all, government policy is important. I think we need to change the tax system, change the benefit system. There is no single, simple way to do that. Different countries have tried different things. We have to be in the game of trying. Finally, we need a completely different culture. We need a culture that's much more pro-natal. I do believe that government can actually play a role in this, and that to some extent culture can be downstream from politics. The first step, however, is for our politicians to acknowledge that this is an issue and to start addressing it. In lots of countries they have done, in Australia, in France. In Britain we've gone backwards. We now have a Prime Minister who says it's none of his business, where so many other things are part of his business. So that, in a nutshell, is the book, while standing on one leg, in principle. Over to you.
That's exactly 5 minutes. Very good. Just to say, it's terrible when the speaker says, I've got 5 questions which I'll talk to you about in my introduction, knowing that I've got 5 questions to ask you, which are very similar. But anyway, I'll put a different spin on them, hopefully. So look...
Well, we can go into all those...
Yeah, exactly. We'll go in more detail. But look, so your book is about fertility and childbearing and what have you. So if I start on the other side of the age spectrum, slightly off your book, really, but in a general point that we all observe in society. You make the point, in 1948 the NHS was founded, there were 300,000 people over 80 in the UK, now there's 5 times that number. Yeah, and you say this is not just social change but a complete social transformation. That's all fair enough. But do you think that this kind of demographic conversation, more broadly than just childbearing, do you think it's kind of more, there's a requirement for greater social care to look after the elderly? Because at some other point in your book you actually talk about die-off of those people who are illiberal enough not to want to have more children. So what's your take on that elderly
Obviously,
issue?
if you have a much older society, you need more people caring for them. Some people have the view that it's always going to be the X number of years in your life, the last 4 years or 5 years. That may be true to some extent, but as we're extending life, I think we're not necessarily getting younger at the age of 60 to the same extent. So we've got massively more 80-somethings, and those 80-somethings will be a bit fitter than an 80-something would have been 30 or 40 years ago. But we're having this exponential growth in the elderly, and we're having a modest growth or even a shrinkage in the younger people. Now, how do you actually cope with that? Well, I was once talking to a Thatcherite cabinet minister, one of the last surviving. I assume he said, the price mechanism will sort it out. And I said, that's fine if you say, well, the price mechanism means if you sit in your own home as an elderly person with no one to cook for you or care for you, that's fine for us as a society. If it's fine for us as a society to say you can't afford a doctor, you can't afford to shop, the market is the market, too bad, the market will sort it out. But if we actually have any kind of compassion as a society, it's simply not going to work. It will express itself as huge government debt, but ultimately government printing money or borrowing money is not going to solve the problem of too few people to do the jobs, and that's a very critical area, actually, elder care, where it's not obvious that technology is going to make a huge amount of difference. So we are going to need those people to do that work. We're going to need them here, despite all the opposition to immigration. And we can already see the pressures for finishing off the elderly, and I think it will be morally disastrous.
Well, I mean, do you want to just develop that point? Because obviously there is you might say compassionate, you might say a non-compassionate argument about euthanasia, about assisted suicide, etc. at the moment.
To an extent, that's a separate question. There's a question about if people are suffering in their last years, in their last days, what do we do about it? And I've got my own views about those, but they're not that relevant. If you are encouraging the dying off of the elderly to solve a demographic problem, you've got a huge moral.
I know, but you say, and let me quote you, right? You say humanity needs to go through a bottleneck during which those people die out who are culturally or genetically of a liberal disposition and refuse to have children.
I don't think I say
you
it
do
needs
say,
to.
You do
When
say,
I say it will...
Well, that's a direct quote.
Okay,
but then you say we should do our best to avoid this.
Yeah,
I get that.
yeah.
I'm not labelling you some kind of
fine.
eugenicist, right? But I'm just saying that that's part of the deal, right? And while you can say that, the assisted suicide thing is a really caring manoeuvre by some people argue that it's the opposite, right? That it actually is trying to get rid of old people. So how do you sit on it?
I think my argument there was that only groups which have attitudes that we consider rather illiberal today, or rather weird or odd or very religious, are having large families. And I'm trying to appeal not to them, but to the liberal general population, who may be religious, but not fanatically. People who want to live in the kind of society we live in. And I'm trying to say to them, if you don't have children, there are plenty of people who will have children. Now, we're not going to become Amish or Haredi or Hutterite tomorrow. But if the mass of the population doesn't want children, and if there is a biological and or cultural meme, if you like, or gene, which predisposes people to having them, then eventually, after the population has declined and declined and declined, those small groups, which will be growing and growing and growing, will eventually become the majority. My PhD supervisor, Eric Kaufman, wrote a book 15 years ago called Shall the Religious Inherit the Earth? And I've got no objection to religious people. I'm quite religious myself. But do I want to live in a society that is made up of traditional Catholics, Haredim and Hutterites? Is such a society even going to work? And to get there, what will the path be like? I'm trying to say to the liberal broader society, we should all be having on average 2 to 3 children. We can keep the show going. That doesn't resolve all the problems of the world, but without doing that, we are going to have a very weird, dysfunctional society at the end of probably a societal breakdown.
Okay, well, the Abrahamic religion thing that you talk about throughout the book, can I leave that till the end, if you like, just to go through a few of the points you raised earlier. So you point out that, as you said, that in poor countries, it's been a general accepted idea, isn't it, that in poor countries, in order to in some way prop up the lack of social care, that people have larger families, and in more wealthy developed societies, we have fewer. But then you say at the end of the book that in many developed countries, that trend is reversing. You mentioned it just earlier. I just wondered, could you explain what's happening more broadly?
If you look at 1970, the world was in a situation of what I call demographic modernity. So pre-modern was the world of Malthus. People bred like rabbits, died like flies, everyone had large families, very few people could control their fertility, and lots of kids died in their first year, and the population didn't grow very much, crudely. That's pre-modern. Modern is that process of industrialization, urbanization, education, whereby first of all death rates fall because people can keep themselves alive, and eventually fertility rates fall. And that's a process of economic progress. What's actually happening now is that countries are getting through that very, very quickly. So a country like India or Ethiopia, surprisingly, Jamaica, first of all, a lot of effort's going into keeping kids alive, so they're getting much lower infant mortality at a given stage of development than they would have in the past. Secondly, there are programs to encourage people to use for contraception, which again I support. So much earlier in a country's economic progress, it's getting to the point where people can control their own fertility and they have a reasonable life expectancy. What happens then is what I call demographic post-modernity, which is what matters is values. What matters is priorities. And the example I give is, these are wealthy countries, but take Israel and South Korea. Very urbanized societies, very prosperous societies, both in their way very successful societies. In Israel, the average woman has 3 children. In South Korea, the average woman has 2/3 of a child. So whereas in the past there would have been that correlation between wealth or education and falling fertility, once we're through that, more of the world is through that because of development programs, because we put a global effort into keeping children alive, we're more and more of us are in this cultural space, this postmodern cultural space, where it's not about can I get the pill, and it's not about do I live in a city, it's actually about what are my values, what are my beliefs, to some extent what's my religion. That's what seems to drive whether people have on average 3 children in a wealthy country or 2/3 of a child. And the difference between 3 and 2/3 of the child is the difference between night and day in terms of the age of the population, the growth of the population, and whether a society has any kind of future or not.
So is it self-levelling? I mean, are you creating a bigger problem than it is? I mean, as we develop, we have fewer children, but in fact, as we develop, we actually have sometimes more children.
Well, it depends on the culture. The trouble is there are more and more South Koreas. Israel is an outlier. More and more countries are getting very low fertility. Countries like Britain, which has had sub-replacement fertility since 1970 or 1972, I mean, it's not actually that precise, but roughly the early 70s, it knocked around at 1.8, 1.9. Now it's coming down to 1.6, 1.5. Countries in Scandinavia, which were models of really good welfare states, really strong support for women in the workplace, Sweden, Finland, which actually had quite high fertility, not replacement level, but only slightly below, they're now coming down. So I think there's a civilizational problem. I think there's a generational problem. I think Generation X, that generation that's moving more and more into their fertility as the previous generation moves out of it, are having their children. They're not starting their families. They may have them late, but all the evidence suggests that lots and lots of people are not having kids in their 20s. Slightly more are having them in their 40s. So there's a little bit of compensation at the end of a woman's fertile years. Everything suggests that most of the developed world and increasing parts of the developing world are moving into a space where they're having smaller and smaller families. What matters, I'm suggesting, with Israel is it's a cultural and religious thing, and that will reverse it. But unfortunately, Israel is really quite exceptional. In the OECD, it has about 3 children per woman. Every other country has below 2 and falling.
Yeah, I mean, there's many factors you go into in the book about the specificity of Israel, marking it out as not typical, but we might come back onto that with the questions. But just moving on to the immigration comments that you made earlier, I mean, you obviously rightly point out that talking about population and fertility, you know, what is it, like the need for greater indigenous population, obviously that can sound quite racist and is very easy to be tarred with that brush these days, but you don't endorse that. That's fine, that's very clear in the book. But you know, there's conscious immigration for the Windrush generation for work and replacement activity, and then there's bringing in new blood, and then maybe there's unsolicited immigration, which you might say is happening at the moment. We have a current problem of immigration. So, what's your thought about the current situation on demographics, productivity, social cohesion, and those kind of things? Because obviously the populations are going up. We are constantly told that this is working age, young people coming off boats, landing on our shores. So what's your take on that?
Well, I wrote in my last book, Tomorrow's People, about the demographic trilemma, and I have written a paper for the ARC conference on that with an economist called Philip Pilkington. So the basic idea of the trilemma is you can have 2 out of 3 things. You can have a small family, what I call egotism for shorthand, other priorities, not prioritising family formation. You can have ethnic continuity and you can have economic dynamism. if you're Japan, you choose ethnic continuity, you don't want immigration. You're choosing the egotism of small families, and the Japanese economy has shrunk relative to the rest of the world, and it's got a problem with lack of innovation. All sorts of issues are just beginning in Japan will be very profound. If you go the UK route, you try to keep the lights on, you try to keep the economy going, you try to avoid getting to Japanese levels of GDP, debt to GDP, which is like 2.5 times ours, but you don't want to have children, then the alternative is mass immigration and ethnic change. Mm-hmm. Israel being the third example where they actually give up the egotism, go for the families, and that way they don't have to have mass immigration. They've obviously had it in the past, and they've got a buoyant economy. I think we can be in the worst of all worlds, however, by having mass immigration, which doesn't even solve our labour problems, because we don't do immigration based on our needs as a nation for people to do the work that should be being done by kids who were born 20 and 30 years ago.
Right, okay. So what's the problem? So let's move on. The women's rights conversation, again, you've just touched upon. You say, let me quote you, you say, feminism should put female autonomy and choice around childbearing front and centre, but it does not necessarily mean less childbearing. I think you hinted at that earlier on. And, I mean, that's fair enough, isn't it? I get that, called choice, isn't it? But we have to confront, I think, you confront the political issues as we find them. And at the moment, you know, a woman's right to an abortion, which in some ways is against your argument, is right. That's illegal in this country, whereas choosing to have a baby is not illegal. So you kind of think if you're going to be talking about women's rights discussions, which you don't necessarily do that, but if you are going to talk about where the priorities lie in your political versus practical agenda, then maybe fighting for women's autonomy not to have children would be a more preferential position than fighting for them to have children.
Well, women have got a right. First of all, the Prime Minister said it's not up to me to decide how many children women should have.
And we all trust him.
It goes without saying that no one wants to force anyone. I'm not proposing ending contraception. I'm not proposing ending abortion. Whatever your views are on abortion, and I have got views on abortion, I don't think they're particularly relevant to demography. Because if you try and force women to have children by not having abortion, there may be other reasons to ban abortion. They will find ways around it. There's a pretty good statistical evidence that whatever the rights and wrongs of the abortion debate, it's not really pertinent to this question, because if you ban abortion, there'll be backstreet abortions, people will make more efforts to avoid having children. So there's a whole range of things, but I'm not talking about coercion. You often get Gilead and the Handmaid's Tale thrown in your face. It just should go without saying that what we're not talking about is forcing anyone to do anything. What we're talking about is what people choose to do, whether they're supported in the choices they make, and what do they actually want? And women say they want 2 to 3 children. Then the question arises, why aren't they having them? Is it housing? Is it lack of partners? Is it childcare? Is it wanting to do other things? Is it leaving it too late? That's an interesting discussion to have. But I think feminists should focus on the fact that women want children. And also there is a legacy, there's a heritage in feminism of celebrating childbearing, which goes back to Mary Wollstonecraft, so the very origins of feminism. But I certainly believe that in a modern society, if we're not going back to the 50s but into the 2030s, it's got to be something that men take as much responsibility in as women. And I always say I changed as many nappies as my wife. I gave up working days when the kids weren't well. If women are as intelligent as men, which I believe they are, if they are participating in the workforce as much as men, which I believe is good, and I've got 2 daughters who are full-time mothers and full-time workers, we've all got to take this on. It's got to stop being a feminist issue, because it's got to be a responsibility for all of us, man and woman, who are interested in us having a future as a community, as a nation, as a human race.
Fine. I think my question was more the fact that it's less about choice conversation, it's about rights, which is a slightly different political
But discussion. I think people have got to have the rights to have children and not have them. I mean,
I don't disagree with that.
Which is why it's about choice.
No. It's a rights issue about where the political priorities lie in terms of which rights are being denied and which rights are already available to people. That's that's an inequality conversation. But I mean, I also proudly will state that I never changed one nappy in my daughter's life. Absolutely disgusting activity. I'll leave it to somebody else.
Well, I'm still changing nappies for my grandchildren. I don't find it disgusting at all.
Some people might delight in that, but there you go. Anyway, look, I'll move on from the feminists. I've got other questions for you, but I'll just move on. In terms of, it's a very similar question in some ways about the environment. I think, to be honest with you, I have queries about the environment, environmentalism, and I think you handle them brilliantly well in the book. It's a terrific chapter. You should buy the book even just for this chapter if you're not interested in demography. But you say that the purpose of the chapter is to show that a thriving environment need not involve human decline. Now, the only problem with that, because you demolish most of the environmental facts and statistics and arguments quite well, but the thriving environment need not involve human decline. But if you listen to an environmentalist, from Paul Ehrlich to David Attenborough, they will tell you that it does. And so I was only wondering whether, is your conclusion of that chapter, of that argument, a little bit naive, in as much as, fair enough, you're saying more people is a good thing, but you're not going to win that argument unless you counter the dominant argument, which is that more people is a bad thing.
Well, I'm trying to counter the argument by writing the book, by being here, by doing podcasts, by going on GB News, BBC, wherever I get a platform, I'm happy to go. I mean, it's very interesting. Paul Ehrlich's still going. I mean, God bless him, at about 95. Still saying the word. He was saying famously in the 1960s, we're all going to starve. The 70s, hundreds of millions of people will die in the 70s because we simply won't have enough food. And he was completely wrong. There was the famous bet he made with Julian Simon about the cost of commodities, where he was wrong. Sadly, Simon's not still with us, but he's very much an influence on some of us. I think the case is that a young, innovative, largely urban society is very good at solving problems, very good at coming up with the sorts of innovations we're already seeing in the world, the solar powers, there's a whole debate about energy, but we know technologically we're miles away from where we were 20, 30 years ago, and that's because of mostly young people coming up with brilliant ideas. We can see as a society ages like Japan, it becomes more sclerotic, it becomes less innovative. More urban nations are nations where emissions are much lower. People living in towns tend to live in smaller, better insulated properties. They use more public transport. So there's a whole range of arguments. But I think I may have already made this argument. If you are saying, I'm not going to have children to save the environment, but you still expect a doctor in the hospital, a nurse in the surgery, someone who's filled the shelves at Tesco so you can do a shop, a bus driver. You expect people to provide you with labour all your life, but you're very grand and very righteous and very green. You're not going to produce any of that labour. Then you have to bring people from very low emissions countries to very high emissions countries. So that brings you to the immigration debate, which is another debate. You're not solving unless you go and live in a cave, you're not actually solving the problem that as a consumer of labour, it rather reminds me, and I think this is our view on energy, our view on energy is we need steel, but we won't produce it because we need coal, we won't produce that, but we will import it from elsewhere. It feels to me a bit like saying, yes, I'm still going to eat, but because agriculture is environmentally problematic, we'll stop farming. We'll just import it, that it won't count against our emissions. I think it's a delusion. I think the way to solve our environmental problems is to have not a population explosion, but a young, dynamic, growing society which focuses on education, a more and more educated society focusing on those problems. And as a human race, we're fantastically good at solving them. The way not to solve them is to refuse to have children, to import low-skilled labour, and to get less and less innovative as a society, which is something we've seen you can actually quantify in Japan.
All right, very good. I mean, just on that, if anybody came to the China session yesterday, I'll repeat an anecdote. But you don't mention China that much in the book, which is fair enough by me. But actually, in Chengdu in China, part of the environmental shtick of China becoming a global environmental player is that it turned Chengdu into a park city, which meant they spent £5 billion making parklands, cycle paths, forests within the urban environment. Last year, President Xi Jinping has a mandate because self-sufficiency in food is now paranoid demand by the Chinese state after COVID. They've basically ripped up all the parks, all the cycle paths, all the footpaths, all the walkways to plant corn and grain. £5 billion down the agenda, and down the drain. Anyway, that's an aside. But in terms of the environmental conversation, one of the things which is very notable by environmentalists is kind of fear of the future. You know, there's many young people today. In some ways, I mean, you don't say this, but I think there's an idea that some people don't have kids because they are afraid of the future. So that idea about, you know, climate fear, women not having kids because humanity's doomed. But then towards the end of the book, you do your own kind of scare story. Petrified me. You say Koreans and Japanese, Jamaicans and African Americans will all disappear in due course if their current fertility rates persist. That might be a logical extension. But aren't you both kind of saying, you know, if you have your own crises and, you know, pick one or the other, are you engaging in kind of an environmental moral blackmail of your own?
Well, I don't think it's moral blackmail. I think it's just a fact that if you are South Korea and the average couple, 2 people, has 2/3 of a child, then you go from 100 grandparents to about 100 grandparents to 33 children to 11 grandchildren. That's just the maths. So,
but, you know, humanity must look itself in the face and realise it's staring into a demographic abyss. God, that's pretty heavy duty, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it's true, and I think that you don't get published and you don't get on the radio, you don't get a slot, the Battle of Ideas, unless you're prepared to state your case fully and robustly. I do think it's that serious. I think we're only at the beginning of it. I mean, even Japan has only relatively recently seen absolute population decline. And the trouble is that once it's built in, if you think about the population pyramid, once it's the wrong way round, lots of old people and not enough young, even if the young people start having quite large families, it takes a long, long time. We've had 50 years of the other way round, where we've had lots of young people because of previous population growth. So even though they're not having many children themselves, the things kept going. That's called demographic momentum. We're going to be in the reverse world, where even if the average Japanese woman had 2 or 3 children, which is hard to imagine from where we are today, there are now so many old people in Japan and so many few young people that we will still have population decline for a couple of generations after you've turned that round. So I think it's high time we start to talk about it and do something about it. A child born today isn't going to enter the labour force for 20 years. And I don't think I'm alarmist, but if you're not prepared to state the case as it is, if you're going to continue to give people bromides, no one's going to do anything about it.
Right, so it's not crying wolf.
I don't think so.
No? Okay. Well, let me end with the point you were hinting at the very beginning, which is you say that, again, quotation, there's a strong connection between societies losing their faith and losing their fertility. And again, you go on about Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam. And you also you point out Hungary having this kind of mandated, but, you know, a pro-natalist policy. Thanks. Left or right authoritarians have strong pro-natalist policies. So, and as you pointed out, you know, you're a fairly liberal kind of guy yourself, so you're not in favour necessarily of a religious autocracy, and you're not in favour of anti-democratic authoritarian regimes. You then seem to are left with this kind of secular religion of nudge. And you talk about the Behavioural Insights team, which, from my remembrance during COVID, was a horrendous authoritarian, organisation or philosophy of psychological manipulation, if you like. So I just wondered whether, are you concerned by some of the implications that you've come to?
Well, the big question is what we're supposed to do about it. The first step is to talk about it and acknowledge the problem. The question is what we're supposed to do about it. Mm-hmm. I do think there are lots of policies governments could try. I think we need a complete cultural shift. But I always say that I'm going to be 60 next month. If the issue is why young people aren't having children, if the issue is why they're not dating, why they're not having sex, why they're not getting married, there's a whole range of things. It's not really going to be me that is going to come up with all the cultural answers as to how we can create a totally different culture. I think it's going to have to be lots of young people, and there are some young people starting to talk about it. There's a limit to what I can suggest. There's a limit to my capability about turning this corner. It's not going to be down to me. I don't want it to be the case that we disappear as a society and we get replaced by a bunch of different, very fanatical groups who I'm not even sure could live together. So I'm trying to appeal to liberal society. I'm trying to appeal to middle-of-the-road governments to say this is a problem, we should be talking about it, we should, as a collective, as a community, be trying to find ways out of it. Now, it may be that we can't do it, that without becoming ultra-religious in some way, shape or form, or totally changing our ideology, we're never going to get out of it. But we haven't even tried yet. So let's give it a go before we throw in the towel and say we'll all have to become Hutterites, Haredim, or
so
something else.
Instead of mullahs, we should have Dominic Cummings giving us a go. All right. Let me just find it. I just got to pull this quote out. You've quoted Starmer, but actually I thought it was an unusually liberal position by a European Union official who said having children is a matter for individual choice in which the EU does not interfere. Indeed, this is a personal choice that no government should interfere in. That's quite interesting.
Well, it's interesting because actually a growing number of EU countries do have pro-natal policies. The EU takes the Starmerite perspective, which is we can hector you and nag you about this, that, and the other, but on this subject we refuse to have a conversation. And what I'm trying to do is to move. I say not to move the Overton window, but to open the Overton window, and to say if people like Macron, you may or may not like him, but you can call him an extremist. People, I actually went on Novara Media and had an interview with Aaron Bastani, and had to, who's actually quite sympathetic, surprisingly, but had to remind him, Stalin was giving out prizes to women. Now that doesn't mean that I'm a Stalinist. Nothing could be further from the truth. Mao was very pro-natal. Yes, so was Hitler. So is Macron. I think the idea of tarring this as something that's necessarily right-wing. I mean, I am right-wing, and I quote my friend Ed West, actually. I think I'm in a quite similar place to him as the extreme right of liberalism. That's probably where I am, but where I am doesn't really matter. My point is that everyone from the left to the right should be interested in this. Bastani came at me with the issue about, well, what about Matt Goodwin? What about Nigel Farage talking about immigration, and at the same time not understand that without immigration we have a deficit in terms of population. And I said to him, I've twice been on GB News with Farage when he did the show. I'm quite friendly with Matt Goodwin, and I've done a guest Substack for him. They are people on the right who are thinking about, okay, if we want the economy to grow and we don't want mass immigration, what are the issues? And I'm pointing out to them that they have an issue around fertility and around population. But I said to Bastani, equally those on the left who want to build a socialist future, and of course that will include a well-funded NHS, a well-staffed NHS, lots of social care. People on the left also need to think through the inconsistencies in their position. What I'm trying to do is inject a bit of demographic realism into the debate. So whether it's Bastani or Farage, or anywhere in between, people understand that whatever their aspirations, whether they're left or right, communist, socialist, capitalist, we need a future population, and that needs to be taken into account of when you're thinking about the sort of society you're going to build.
Very good, very good. All right, well, I've got a few more questions left, but I'll let them hang. So it's kind of out to you for a question or two. Good on you. I'll take you, sir.
Okay, so I'm glad you kind of implicitly mentioned the so-called sexual recession in terms of people having fewer partners, because I'm just wondering how you reconcile that with your earlier comments, because obviously, because I would say that comes from a crisis of intimacy that's cultural. I'm not just talking about the armies of incels out there on the internet, but also in terms of you've got the whole Me Too, sexual harassment, kind of people being a little bit reticent about that, obviously reticent about asking younger women out, whatever. So it does seem to me that those issues are deeper than government policy. You're not going to alter that by changing the tax regime. So how do you tackle those sorts? Because I would say those issues are actually totally immune from government policy. And on the religious thing, what's wrong with there being religious people having I mean, in terms of even if they were nutcases, right? A is that a lot of them, you know, we're talking about defending Western civilization. A lot of them probably are more into Western civilization. There is the argument that maybe we should let the liberals die out, even not having kids, because they're very against you know, they put a lot of pernicious ideas against Western civilization. And secondly, even if it was the Islamic or whatever, you are going to have, from generations, people, the younger people are going to rebel, and maybe they'll rediscover the liberalism or whatever, you know, in their own way. So I'm not sure it would be a future of theocracy forever.
All right, just because that was a long question, and there's probably two questions actually. No, you can take your time, but I'm just saying there's two questions there. So address that. And can I just quickly see any hands? Oh, very good, very good. All right, okay. So we'll just take this gentleman first, and then I'll come to you, and I'll come back to you. Yeah.
Okay, so shall I answer those 2 points? Please, So the first point was the cultural issues, which I think, so why is this happening? You know, social scientists look at things like women's education. It's very interesting. The more educated, the lower the fertility. Until you get to PhD level, then it goes up a little bit. Look at income, inequality. There are a whole range of things. And some of them I can comment on, some of them I can't. When it comes to what's happening with young people and their relationships, I always say I went on my first date with my wife in 1985. So I think as a demographer, I ought to know where to say this is a really big issue. I can look at certain things, but what is the problem with youth? Even all my children are in their 20s are now married. So I just don't think I'm qualified to say very much on that. I think it's an issue. I think it's really important. I hope lots of people much better qualified than me are going to take it up. I don't really understand it. So that's the first thing. On the religious issue, I'm not anti-religious at all. But the example I give is a friend of mine, actually, who's a dentist. And he is quite an Orthodox Jew. He has 4 children. And he is trusted by the ultra-Orthodox to be their dentist. So they all flock to him from Stamford Hill to Golders Green, where he's got his practice. But they don't want to be dentists, because it's not that they can't, but first of all, they prefer their sons to study the Talmud, and actually you need to do an awful lot of biology and a lot of studying that they're not very comfortable doing to become a dentist. It's not to say none of them could become dentists. Now, that's just one case. Those people depend on my friend, and I think small ultra-religious groups who don't want to live in the modern world depend on the rest of us to be their doctors, their lawyers, their, you know, a whole range of things, whatever it is they don't want to do. And I think while they're tiny minorities, that works. Once they become a majority, it becomes difficult. Now, in the long run, when we've gone through that bottleneck and everyone's a religious fanatic, could liberalism be reborn? It probably would be. But I mean, that's beyond my scope as a futurologist, I'm afraid.
All right, you happy with that? Yeah, good, okay. Can we take you, sir?
Yeah. Hi, Paul. I've read your book. I think there's 2 books in there in terms of 2 themes. I think there's the falling fertility theme, which, you know, I think is very, very important for cultural and for social reasons, but not at all for economic ones. Which leads me to the second book I read in there, which is this book about what you call demographic realism, which I call demographic delusion. You know, you can say, to get the publishers on board, I have to be a little bit apocalyptic and talk about, you know, looking into the abscess and stuff. But it is an alarmist book. I mean, the title, No One Left, right? Which, as you know, is even extrapolating from what's going on in the world today in terms of declining birth rates is not around the corner, you know, by the figures which I'm sure you reference them in there somewhere. It's about, you know, 12 centuries away. So it's you know, hardly around the corner. So first question on writing it, I mean, given that the history of demographic forecasting has been so many times proven dysfactual, it's been proven wrong so many times, and we're not just talking about Paul Ehrlich and about Thomas Malthus, who were predicting, you know, overpopulation and you know, running out of food and you know, wars and devastation. But there's a lot of low fertility demographers in the past, very bright people, who have predicted exactly what you are now. So John Maynard Keynes, you know, one of the brightest economists of the 20th century, who was writing very similar things to you about the economic damage of low fertility by the 1930s. Obviously that was disproved. Even Margaret Thatcher, I don't know if people know, I think Margaret Thatcher was the first Prime Minister to talk about the demographic time bomb back in the early 80s, in fact. She predicted as well, low fertility, not enough babies, we're going to run out of young people, she said, by 1985. Yeah? That's what her demographers told her at the time. There won't be enough people. What happened, 1995, I should say, 1995, 12 years later. Obviously, a lot of youth unemployment then. You talk about labour shortages today. We had a discussion yesterday about worklessness. There's 11 million people of working age are not working. So the idea that we're running out of people, we're running out of workers, isn't my question to you. Did you never have any qualms or second thoughts when you're writing it? Because you will know of all those demographic predictions which have been so falsified by reality.
Well, the original title I wanted to use was Procreate or Perish, but I was told that was too Old Testament, so that one got dropped. Look, first of all, it's very interesting you say 1995, Thatcher thought we would have a problem.
No, yes, she thought
in 1995.
1995 yeah.
And we didn't have a problem, but what started to happen in 1997, we got mass immigration. She could never have forecast that half of Eastern Europe would end up coming here. So all sorts of things can happen. When it's just a national problem, you can have mass immigration. When it's a global problem, I'm not sure where the people are going to come from. So I can't. So Keynes, Keynes is really interesting, because Keynes was writing it in the interwar years when British fertility was low-ish, nothing as low as it is today. Of course, infant mortality rates were higher, and therefore the replacement level was high. Nobody expected the post-war baby boom. And it came as a real surprise, and we call it the post-war baby boom, but actually it peaked in the year I was born in Britain in 1964, so it's still going quite strong. I'm not saying that couldn't happen, and if we are back here in 20 years' time, and we, you're in the audience, or maybe you're speaking and I'm in the audience, and you say to me, look, there you sat in 2024, and here we are, if we're still around, if I'm still around, in 2044, and the average woman in Britain's having 3 kids, no one would be more delighted than me. First of all, I'm saying this is happening, right? We are going to low fertility as a global phenomenon. It's not just a British phenomenon anymore, or a developed world. Secondly, if it remains this low, or continues to go lower, there are some very serious consequences. I cite again the example of Japan, 100 million people in the 60s, 8 workers for every retiree, back to 100 million.
No, that's false. You're talking about working age.
I'm talking about working age. Now, of course, working age, you can shift.
Workers to
well, let me just address that.
Working age people don't work.
Yeah, first of all, you can move the working, you can move the, and I'm sure the person of 65 in Japan in the 60s was much older and less capable of working than the 65-year-old will be in 2040. But that doesn't, and you can, that doesn't substitute for a ratio of 8 to 1 going to a ratio of 1 to 1. It might mean you can go from 3.5 to 3 without noticing the difference. In terms of the people who are not working in the UK, when I was born, a lot of women didn't work. When I was entering the workforce, there was mass unemployment in the 80s. Today, we have a problem of non-participation. But if you actually look at the percentage of people working as a share of people of working age, and the data amazingly seems to go back to the 1850s, we're at the high end. So there's a 75%. So there's a sense that a quarter of the population is never going to work it for whatever reason. Now, that could be challenged, that could be changed. It hasn't been for 150 or 200 years.
It's higher elsewhere, as you know.
Yes, it's somewhat higher elsewhere. It could be moved a bit, but again, I don't think that is going to substitute for going from the sort of ratio you had in Japan of 8 to 1 to 1. So there are things you can do, and those things include the fact that you can delay the retirement age, unpopular though it is. You can encourage more people into the workforce. But these, to me, seem to be quite small things compared to the fact that we've now had 50 years of sub-replacement fertility. They appear to be quite small things if you're heading to the sort of place that career is, where you've got 2/3 of a child per couple. And I'm not saying that it won't change, that it won't turn up, that something won't happen. I'm forecasting and projecting what will happen if current trends continue. And I'm suggesting that we as a society start thinking about this problem, and starting to think about this problem, starting to address it, is perhaps one of the ways that we will turn the corner on it. Just like Paul Ehrlich talking about the population bomb in the 60s had a very big effect on, it seems to have had a very big effect on US policy on aid and contraception, and actually to have had, you can't, the reason I'm not totally anti-Ehrlich is, to be fair to him, his writings had an effect that people countervailed what he was arguing about. He was saying, we're lost, we're going to expand, there's going to be a disaster. And because he said that, there were more efforts made to ensure contraception was universally available. And that actually disproved him because of his own prophecies, if you like. Now, as I said, if we come back in 20 years' time and we're back to a fertility rate of 2 or 3, and maybe I played my little part in that, then I'm prepared to put my hand up and say I was wrong.
Very good. Hold fire. Yes, please.
Yeah, so I'm a sociologist for generations, and I also lecture in social policy. And particularly I've looked at cultural constructions of generations, and particularly the construction of the baby boomers as a social problem. So what I'm trying to say is, I think demography is very important. I mean, from a policy point of view, you've got to know what we're dealing with this population. But I've also separated in my writing, demography from what I call doomography, which is the loading on of sort of social, cultural, existential anxieties onto numbers. And, we've seen this with overpopulation, it's been said, so particular concerns about the environment, then you've had the ageing thing, which is a particular concern about the labour market. I do think even if, lots of people might be working, but they're not doing very much, are they? That's the thing, that's the productivity problem. It's not about the numbers. What you seem to be suggesting is that, which is a lot of the current discussion about falling fertility, seems to be an anxiety about cultural reproduction, so my question to you is this a distraction from looking at other things? And doesn't it kind of rely on some of the problems of just eugenic thinking in general in terms of looking at natural solutions to actual cultural problems? Because I do think, the falling birth rates and everything else, it does say something about how societies see themselves, right? If a society doesn't want to reproduce itself, then that's quite bad. But I don't think you can solve that on the terrain of fertility. I think the way I look at it is more like what you want is to have a discussion about how we have a better society now, a terrain of kind of better human flourishing and more kind of optimism, everything else. But that's what we saw in the post-war boom, actually, the baby boom and the economic boom, and that general kind of cultural moment. I think you could also say that's why Israel actually is more cohesive than a lot of Western societies, and maybe that's why it has more children. And I think that might lead to a society where it's more conducive to people having children. It might not. There's no direct relationship between culture and women's fertility decisions. But the trouble is, if you try and do it the other way around, all you do is you reproduce the cultural fragmentation of your current society through the children you have. So, is there an argument I'm saying?
Are you saying that alarmism is actually counterproductive? That creating instead of producing optimism, which is what you're saying, may then make everybody so happy that they have lots of kids, but the alarmism may actually make people retreat?
I think so, and I think we've got to be nuanced. The discussion about, for example, of young people not having kids because they're worried about the environment. The data on that seems to be very inconclusive, actually. We know there's a kind of a general kind of cultural pessimism and everything, but people make their individual decisions more about the kind of concrete things that are going on in their lives.
Mm-hmm. So in my book, for example, I don't say, it's all because there's a worry about the environment. I simply say, that's there. I look at the data, and you're absolutely right. The data doesn't suggest that lots of people are not having children because of that. But some are. That's an issue, and it needs to be addressed in my book. So I completely agree with you that this book is not the only book that should be published in the decade, right? Let's talk about culture, let's talk about flourishing, let's talk about psychology, talk about all of those things, and they're all interrelated. I completely agree with you. I don't think this little book is a distraction, really, in the greater culture, with all the ideas that are out there, all the thoughts, all the arguments. It's my little contribution to say, let's also think about demography. But I think it's absolutely valid for people like you to come in and say, can we put it into a bigger picture? I think that's very important. So I don't disagree with you. And I don't think it's an alarmist book, because I am optimistic, and I think a spirit of optimism, I'm optimistic for a number of reasons. I'm optimistic because women still say they want children. I'm optimistic because very educated women still have slightly more children than barely educated women. It's a whole set of reasons to be optimistic. I'm optimistic because I think we can probably crack this. I don't have all the answers as to how we can crack it, but I do think my little book is a little contribution to say, let's talk about it and let's get it into the public sphere and let's realise it's a problem and let's think about the ways that we can address it. How can we address it? I accept I've got limitations because of my particular point of view, where I am in the... And I think the contributions along the lines that you're talking about are really important. So I don't think it's a distraction, because I think it's just one little piece of the mosaic of the wider public conversation. And I couldn't address everything in one book. And I didn't begin to have the answers to everything. It's just my little contribution. Have you read the book?
No, and I'm looking forward to reading it. I wasn't attacking the book.
No, I understand that.
This current discussion about the birth rate, which suddenly is now taken over the ageing discussion about the kind of, ratio business. Now suddenly there's this big concern about no one's having children in general. And to me that seems to be indicative of some wider anxiety. And that's really what I meant about
it's very
distraction, in general, of where our thoughts are going.
It's very difficult for me to have an objective view on how big this issue is in the public debate, because all my friends and family, since I started writing about demography, are telling me, this is becoming more... And I think it's a bit of an optical illusion from their part, because I'm talking about it and I'm writing about it and I'm giving them books and they're hearing me. They suddenly start listening to it. So I don't know whether it really is becoming more salient in the public conversation. If it is, I think that's a good thing.
Okay, very good. You, madam. So take... go on, crack on.
I wanted to ask, do you think that the Republican desire to stop abortions and maybe have no contraception in America has anything to do with demographics that they're worried about, or is it simply religious and moral?
I can't really talk about their motivations, so I'm not an American, I'm not a Republican. So if the question is what is really motivating this in the US, I don't have a view. If the question is, would a harder line on abortion solve the fertility problem, whatever its pros and cons, I don't believe it would. And I actually think a pro-natal argument, which gets mixed up in the debate on abortion, is not a good idea. I think if I start spouting off about abortion, then the whole argument about pro-natalism gets just thrown in the right-wing bucket. And so that's, in terms of the discourse. In terms of the effects of... There's a very famous case. Ceausescu woke up one morning and decided there weren't enough ethnic Romanians. So, good communist that he was. He was happy for the Hungarians to go to Hungary and the Jews to go to Israel and the Germans to go to Germany. And you could even get contraception in the Hungarian areas, apparently. But he wanted good Romanians. And he overnight put a ban on abortion and contraception. Certainly contraception, I presume abortion as well. And there was a spike in the birth rate. And this is Romania in the 60s. Within about 4 years, it was back to where it had been. People, even in that society, find ways around things. We're in a much better educated, much wealthier society, much more mobile society. So whatever the arguments are about abortion, I don't believe that a harder line, whatever the Republicans think, and I don't know what they're thinking, I don't have a window onto the soul of J.D. Vance, but whatever they are thinking, whatever the rights and wrongs of abortion, I don't think it's going to fix the fertility problem.
Okay. Take you, madam.
I have two questions. One is which is, do you think that part of the reason that women aren't having babies is that motherhood has been completely devalued? I was having a discussion with a friend of mine who's 28 last night, and she said that among her friendship group, people are actually... they're almost embarrassed to say that they want to have kids, and she said that they actually sort of admitted it to themselves, that actually they do want kids, but they feel like actually they need to prioritise their careers because it's almost embarrassing to be able to say that one of their greatest hopes is to be a mum, and she said they just started to talk about this. The other thing is, I was on the tube last night, and there's so many adverts about IVF, about egg freezing, and again my friend said in their social media feeds there's so many targeted adverts for them at their age, freezing your eggs, having IVF, which is they're completely missold because there's actually extremely low success rates for that kind of thing. And so my question is, how much of this do you think is driven by the reproductive industry, which that's like £1 billion industry with low success rates? How much of it is driven by that industry wanting to make money, saying to women, have children later, have them in your 40s, which they're not going to have that much success, rather than actually saying to young women, actually teaching them about fertility and declining fertility, which is just not happening. So those are my questions.
Well, great questions. The first one, I'm not a 20-something woman spending my time having those conversations, and I don't know what the data is. I'm very pleased that both my daughters, having got excellent degrees and pursuing excellent careers, both had their first children before they were 30, but I suppose they may have a little bit of parental pressure. I couldn't possibly comment on that. But so this is where I don't know, if I start pontificating about the quality of the conversation among 20-something women, I'm out of my depth. I do think there needs to be a cultural shift. So the fact that they're not having them, I can believe what you're saying, and the question then is how do we shift the culture so that having kids young is a really, not only supported by the tax system and the benefit system, but is also really supported by the culture, by what's trendy, by what people want to do, by what their friends are doing. And I don't know how to shift that, but I think it does need to shift. So a friend of mine is the head of, I never remember the body, the Human Fertility, there's a cat, thank you, Julia Chain is a friend of mine, and we were having this conversation, and that's what she's a non-exec chair, she's been a lawyer, it's a honorary position, but she said it's so important that people understand what their prospects are if they follow this. She said she's got 4 kids, and she said, we could have sex 4 times a day. I'm not. Her husband's also a friend of mine. Who knows what they were up to in their 20s? But she said we could have sex 4 times a day. We could have real opportunities in every cycle. A really good opportunity to have children. I presume she had 4 kids, probably by the time she was in her early 30s, and compared to the prospects of succeeding with all this kind of fertility treatment, even though it's getting better and it's getting more effective, the chances of it working compared to the good old natural method are pretty low. Now, if you were a cynical anti-capitalist, you could say, the forces of capital just want women to delay having children so that they can sell them these technologies. I don't know if that's true, and I don't tend to be that kind of sort of communistic anti-capitalist conspiracy theory. But I do think I was having this discussion with Miriam Cates, who's one of the very few, she's no longer an MP sadly, but one of the very few politicians who did talk about this issue. And she had she was actually a biology teacher, and she had a really sensible idea, which is why don't we teach teenage youngsters what the curve is, the fall-off of your fertility rate in your 30s. So you actually have a sense that, I really ought to be getting this underway by 30, and by 35 I might be having serious problems. And if you get that into people's minds, it's not propaganda, it's education. The French are talking about fertility checkups for people in their early 20s. Now, what's that going to do? It will pick up a few cases, but the main thing, it will get people thinking about it. So there may be quite small things you could do that would really have an impact. But the really difficult thing is changing that culture, and I don't have all the answers to it. But I'm sure the answer is going to be, however much better the technology gets, to encourage people to change the way they run their lives, so that they don't necessarily think I have to have a gap year, then I have to do a degree, then I have to get a master's, then I have to find myself for 2 years travelling around Latin America, then I'll get a job, then I might get a partner, and by the time I get to 35 I might start having a child. Unless we change that as the way that people are running their lives and think it's the coolest and best and most self-enhancing thing to do, we're not going to solve the problem. At this stage, we won't solve it through technology.
Thanks. By the way, I was going to give you a glass of water after he finished his answer, but his barbarically long answer made me watch you suffer. So apologies.
I'll try and give barbarically short answers from now on.
All right, good show of hands here. Take you, sir, and you. I'll come back to you. Yeah. You.
You made 2 references to the You made two references to the role of population decline on innovation, which is a subject I teach. Population decline will lead to limits on innovation, and ethnic continuity, egotism you talked about in Japan, leads to lack of innovation. Now, I don't regard Japan as being a particularly uninnovative society, or industry and so on. But what's your, I'm assuming more than a correlation, what's your causation for that observation?
There is some data in Japan that the number of patents that have been submitted has gone down.
Right.
We certainly think of Japan in the 60s, 70s, maybe the 80s as the sort of place all sorts of new technology was coming out of in a way it isn't today. I just anecdotally believe that most exciting innovations are going to come from young people. Now, when you have most of your young people not educated, not going to school, necessarily secondary school, or even university, or even secondary school, then you're obviously not maximising the potential of your children. And so a country that's still poor has still, even if it's got a decline in numbers, has still got an enormous opportunity by pushing its population towards the educational frontier, if you like. But once most of your kids, almost all your kids are getting educated to the age of 18, and a very large proportion who can benefit from it are going to university, which has been the case with a lot of societies for quite a long time now, you're not going to wring any more innovation out of the growing education of your population. But if you have a shrinking number of young people, I think it creates an environment. It creates an environment. You're also just going to have fewer people doing STEM subjects. You're going to have fewer people in the universities. The universities are going to start declining. That's not to say, I mean, you must know much more about the innovative process than I do, and it's very complex, and it's hard to understand how it happens. But I just think a decline, a year-on-year, generation-on-generation decline in the number of young people is not going to be conducive to the kind of incredible innovation and technological advances that we've got used to seeing.
Right. Okay. So it is a correlative thing, but you're
there is some data on it being correlative, and I think anecdotally we know that the young have got all the best ideas.
Excuse me. Beg to differ.
An aside, Carl Jurassic, who invented one of the technologies that birth control built, I think he was in his 50s when he invented that. Counter your point.
I love that quotation, or that saying. The plural of anecdote is not data.
Anecdata, yeah.
Right,
yeah.
Apparently that's hilarious amongst the demographers. Right, you sir, and then you madam, and you stop coughing, and then I come back to you two. Am I right? Is nobody else? Yeah, cool. Okay. Yes, you sir, and you madam.
Okay, so I have two kind of fairly concise questions. My first one is, I wonder what the kind of book tagline is, why the world needs more children, as opposed to why the kind of West needs more children, given the very high birth rates in the global South. I think my second question is on what do you think the kind of causes are precisely of the birth rate in Japan and South Korea, with the hikikomori, I believe it is. Hikikomori people in Japan, kind of men staying indoors, not engaging at all with women. And on the opposite side of the spectrum, we've got the 4B movement in South Korea, which is women basically avoiding men at all costs in terms of marriage, sex, and relationships.
On the first one, my whole point is it's not a Western or a white thing anymore. It's a China problem, it's a Japan problem, it's a Thailand problem, it's a Jamaica problem. I could go on, it's a Lebanon problem, it's an Iran problem.
Got it.
So it's just not the case that it's about the West. It is about the West, but it's also about other cultures. What are the specific things about Japan and Korea that it's so low for so long in Japan and so low in Korea? I think it's all the effects that are of modernity, plus laid on very thickly, extremely urban, very competitive societies, and the lack of an Abrahamic tradition. I mean, I know there's a lot of Christianity in Korea, but it seems to me that where you don't have Islam, Christianity, or Judaism in your culture, once you get to a certain level of modernity, the fertility rate seems to drop particularly quickly. Now, why that is that? Because it expresses itself in relationships between the sexes, a lack of pressure to perform what had been biblically normal. Whatever it is, it seems to be where you don't have the Abrahamic tradition, the fertility rate goes very low and very fast downward.
Okay, I'm sorry to trample on you. Are you all right with that?
Yeah.
You're going to say that you're not a Japanese incel, so you don't know the answer to the second question.
No, I mean, I don't have anything particularly original to say on Japanese incels, except I think Japan has all those social problems that other cultures have, plus sort of laid on thick.
Yeah, and I would argue I totally agree with kind of professional culture and stuff like that. There's such a in Korea and Japan where, you know, you're expected to work pretty much, it's not just 9 to 5, it's 9 till 9 and onwards.
Yeah. You, madam?
A few things. I think you are right about, I'm a midwife and I've seen the falling birth rate. One of the big issues is the reluctant grandparents. Most of the people would say to me, I'm only having 1 or 2. The grandparents were out cruising. Grandparents have gone. A voluntary sector, I think, has been, people now older, they retire and then they live the life they've always wanted to live. I think that has a big impact. The women I'm delivering have more complicated deliveries because obviously in the past you would have expected a child to be, you get the old one that was brain damaged by the birth process. We try to avoid that now, which means we have more cesareans, which lowers women's fertility, and also means they're told usually not to have more than 2 cesareans. So that will drop the birth rate as well, so we've got a higher portion of those. I think also as well, the countries that you said we're supposed to get our carers from for our old people, that's not happening, and I'm actually involved where we have a lot of men coming over as asylum seekers who are being put into the care sector in elderly care at night, and they don't want to be there either because, like I say, we've got a population that won't work. But we also have things like Philippine nurses who are not coming over now because of our gender ideology, so the recruitment companies that were recruiting to come over and work here for a year, leave their families and the care of their elder, which they're now having to do more of as well, are now refusing to come because of that situation of gender changing rooms in hospitals. It's gone over like an immediate news bulletin to them, so the recruitment agencies are now having problems to do their usual recruitment that they bring over for the next year. So that's going to have a big impact. And they go to the care sector because they're not as well educated nursing-wise, so they're not going to be frontline nursing, they're going to be in the care homes, the community, all the sort of places where the elderly are.
Well, thank you for those insights. The one thing I can, I'm not in the business anymore of having children myself, but I can do grandparental care, and I find that a joy, but I also consider it as a way of signalling to my children that if they have more children themselves, they will get support. I think the role of grandparents is very important and very joyous.
Whereas I told my daughter never to have any. Right.
Says the man who never changed a nappy.
So that's one of the reasons. Exactly.
He's quite a nice guy.
Yeah. Not on this issue. Children and animals. Those are my 2 pet heads. You and.
Yeah. So I just wanted to respond to this. The question is, has motherhood been devalued? This came up a lot yesterday in the session on parental authority and the family, and I also work on parenting culture. And, right, first thing, it's a bit weird, right? This is a real millennial conceit that motherhood's deep. I mean, anyone would think the women's liberation movement didn't happen. The mothers back in the middle of the 20th century were held in great regard. I mean, that's the point. That's why we fought for some kind of liberation and everything else. So there's a weird thing kind of happening with this. And I think I think more the problem is that it's been over-fetishised and turned into some kind of identity. I mean, so the fact now that, people are into such, you should get pregnant and then you should do it like this and you should behave like this and, you've got to be at the right time of your life and everything else. And it's kind of like a strange kind of individualised status that it's been turned into, which obviously doesn't marry up with how people are having their lives. Obviously you need 2 people to make a baby. And if anything, the problem is that the family, the family has been devalued and put under tremendous pressure by all the intervention in it. The attempt to solve all manner of social, economic and cultural problems by training people how to be parents, by kind of making the workings of family life according to expert advice. So I think that's kind of quite interesting. I mean, I think, I do think that there's a real role for some better policies around childcare, also elder care and all the rest. But I sort of think really society needs to back off when it comes to these things and provide people with the space to work out you know, the kind of lives they want to have, which is, you know, you're saying often does include children in it in an idealistic fashion, but not when it's kind of done according to some kind of weirdo plan, which is either terrifying them about, you know, the drop-off, which already happens, by the way. My experience, young women they're obsessed with their periods, they're obsessed with their fertility, the way we never were. You know, there's a sort of, but it doesn't translate into them having children, you know, and so it's that sort of, yeah, I think maybe just kind of trying to get a bit more historical perspective on what's kind of going on here that isn't just about individual decision making, but is more looking at the framework in which these things happen. Sorry for the rant.
Are you on that? Are you kind of saying stop problematising the process, whether it's best is best or...
Bodies. You know, which is not...
Sorry.
The state, I think you're
Yeah,
referring
the
state,
yes,
yes,
out
the
of
state.
women's bodies and out of family life. And then actually you'd be amazed by how much difference that would make to people's ability just to be able to just have children.
Are you in accord with
I
that?
don't have to.
No, but are you in accord with that? Because you've done the behavioural insights team, which I'm going to bang on about.
The trouble is
as a
that I
promotion
think
for
we
this.
live in a world where the government expects people to do everything for them. Now, you know, I'm that sort of late Thatcherite generation where I kind of hope that as people got wealthier and more educated, they'd do more for themselves, which is why the penultimate chapter of my book is what government can do for us, and my last chapter is what we can do for ourselves. So I do ultimately think, although all my sort of younger right-wing friends who are sort of cultural conservatives sort of trying to persuade me that the government can affect the culture, and it can to an extent, I think ultimately if this isn't something we want as individuals or as a society or as a community or as a people, if you have no interest in your genes, your family, your nation, your people, your race, your human... the human race going on, then there's nothing government can do to fix it. So I think it's actually got to be a change of heart.
Through the behavioural insights team.
I mentioned them, I didn't set them up.
Oh, it was very clear. Anyway, Phil, I think you've got the last word. I mean, last question. Yeah.
Just on the motherhood and family values one, if people want to read, I think you may have read it already, there's an interesting article in this month's Foreign Affairs by Nicholas Eberstadt, which is called On the Age of Depopulation. And you know, he agrees with some of your points, but he's also much less apocalyptic than you are. It's quite positive, in fact, in the end. But they've done lots of studies as to why fertility rates have fallen, and the sort of the theme, you know, having knocked down all the arguments about, you know, housing's too expensive, childcare is too inconvenient and stuff, they say that the common thing across societies is what they call the retreat from marriage. And the sense, and I think that is where things start. So people put off or don't want to get involved in intimate relationships, right? That they and part of that is putting off marriage till later, and obviously the data validates that. But I think that's that sense of, or that cultural climate in which, as Jenny says, the role of marriage and family, and the role of family has been so devalued and even demonized that families have turned from being, you know, a place where you nurtured and brought up your children to being this scene of toxicity. You know, men beat up women, the women abuse their children. You know, that image, that way of discussing family has become prominent. I mean, Miriam Cates, I think, is very good on that point in terms of explaining how that demonisation of the family has contributed to more fertility. So I think that is a very important discussion to continue. Just on the innovation thing, as I'm at the time, I mean, and to answer Nico, there are in fact lots of studies which unfortunately negate your anecdotes.
Fortunately negate my anecdotes. Fortunately negate his anecdote.
No, negate your anecdote.
Oh good, so that the older population will be creative.
Well, there's no
Excellent.
determinate correlation between age and innovation. There's a study in America quite recently, I can send you the references to it, which looked at all the startups, the growth, the successful startups. Obviously, a lot of startups never go anywhere, but of successful startups in America. And the top 5% of successful startups, so the fastest growing 5% of American startups, the average age of the founder was 42.1. And when I looked at the top 0.1%, and you know these sort of figures, that's important, the top 1% of fastest growing, the average age of the finder was 45. And there's a lot of other data, multiple studies done, which show this idea that innovation is a youth thing is wrong. And one of the reasons for that is that companies don't generally all have 22-year-olds in them. The way we organise is generally there's more of a diverse range of people. So even being able to try to say the ideas people are these 20-year-olds are coming out, actually the ideas and the new thinking comes out of a collective of people who have wisdom, and a lot more experience, a lot more judgment because they're a little bit older. And I think that's why it's more likely to be in the 40s and late 40s that you're successful than if you just come out of school or come out of college.
Yeah.
The data's there.
Elon Musk is 53, isn't he? And he's got 12 kids or something.
I suspect he has, and he thinks.
I don't know where he finds the time.
Thinks there's a real. I just conclude with saying, first of all, there is data in the book to support the alternative point of view. I suspect that a large young population, many try startups, and then there's a sort of honing process, and a small number start, a smaller number have another go, and a smaller number still have a third go, and often it's the third time in a world where you're prepared to fail. But you need a big hopper to start with. The smaller the hopper, the smaller the number of 40-year-olds who are going to be making a great success of it.
Very good, very good. Any final roundups by the book? Because you're going to be...
I'm going to be signing the book somewhere. So
yeah. All right, look, so...
all books get signed.
Well, I have no big finish for you, but generally it's a cracking book.
Thank you very much.
And what a brave position to be in, to take such flack and support and endorsement. No, there were some difficult questions, let's be honest. So look, it's a great book, great read. Like I say, covers everything from immigration to environmentalism from a critical perspective, and you should really get a copy.